The men who arrived at Verdun in early 1916 did not yet know they were walking into one of the most deliberate killing machines ever devised by modern warfare. The landscape looked ordinary enough at first glance: rolling hills, dense forests, small stone villages scattered along the Meuse River. It did not resemble the apocalyptic wastelands which would later define Verdun's name. But beneath the quiet soil lay concrete forts, steel turrets, and carefully measured artillery ranges. This was not a battlefield chosen by accident. Verdun was selected to break an army, not by speed or surprise, but by endurance. The soldiers who would fight there would later struggle to describe it with words. Many settled on one phrase: l'enfer vivant, living hell. Winter 1915, the First World War had become what no one had planned. The grand maneuvers imagined by generals in 1914 had gone wrong. The Western Front had hardened into a continuous scar of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. There, millions of men faced each other across narrow strips of mud and barbed wire, locked in a stalemate defined by artillery, machine guns, and attrition. Every major offensive had followed the grim pattern of days or weeks of bombardment: infantry assaults that gained a few hundred meters at enormous cost, and then counterattacks that erased those gains. The Somme had not yet happened. Ypres had already shown the terrifying power of poison gas. Neuve-Chapelle, Loos, Champagne, all had consumed lives without delivering decision. Germany, fighting a two-front war against France and Britain in the west and Russia in the east, was searching for a way out of the deadlock. Its resources were finite. Its enemies were not. The longer the war lasted, the worse Germany's position became. It was in this context that one man proposed a different idea of victory. Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, did not believe Germany could win the war through a traditional breakthrough. He believed France could be destroyed psychologically and militarily by forcing it to defend something it could not afford to lose. According to historical records, Falkenhayn's logic was brutally simple. France, he believed, was near exhaustion. Its manpower reserves were shrinking. Its political system was fragile. If Germany attacked a target of immense symbolic importance, France would pour men into its defense regardless of cost. Germany, meanwhile, would concentrate overwhelming artillery fire and bleed the French army white. This would not be a battle of movement. It would be a battle of arithmetic. Verdun was chosen because it was sacred. Verdun was not just a fortress complex. It was a symbol of French national survival. For centuries, it had guarded the eastern approaches to France. During earlier wars, it had withstood sieges that had become part of French military mythology. To abandon Verdun would be to admit vulnerability at the heart of the nation. The French public knew the name. Politicians knew it. Soldiers knew it. That was precisely why Falkenhayn chose it. Verdun sat on a salient, a bulge in the French lines, making it vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. Its ring of forts, once considered impregnable, had been partially disarmed earlier in the war. French high command, underestimating the power of heavy artillery, had removed many guns to reinforce other sectors. To the Germans, Verdun looked like an invitation. But Falkenhayn's goal was not merely to capture the city. According to his post-war writings, the objective was to create a killing zone so intense that France would be forced to sacrifice its army piece by piece to hold it. Verdun would become a grinder. In early February 1916, the area around Verdun still resembled a functioning landscape. Villages stood intact. Roads existed. Forests were dense with trees. French troops rotated through the sector, believing it to be relatively quiet compared to other fronts. They were wrong. German engineers had been preparing for months. Railways were expanded. Ammunition depots were stocked. Artillery batteries, hundreds of them, were carefully positioned and camouflaged. Some of the largest guns ever used on the Western Front were aimed at a narrow sector north of Verdun. French intelligence detected unusual activity, but warnings were downplayed. The French High Command believed Verdun was well defended. They believed any German attack would be limited. They did not understand that this was not meant to be limited at all.
At 7:15 in the morning, the sky over Verdun broke apart.
German artillery opened fire with a ferocity unseen even by the standards of the First World War. Shells of every caliber slammed into French positions. Forests were shredded into splinters. Trenches collapsed instantly. Communication lines vanished in minutes. According to eyewitness accounts, the ground itself seemed to rise and fall. Men were buried alive before they could move. Others were thrown through the air like ragdolls. The noise was so overwhelming that soldiers later reported permanent hearing loss after only hours. This was not a bombardment meant to soften defenses. It was designed to annihilate them. For 9 hours, the shells did not stop. When German infantry finally advanced, they expected to find little resistance. In many sectors, they were right. Entire French units had ceased to exist. Survivors stumbled in shock, deafened and disoriented. But in pockets where French soldiers remained, resistance was fierce. Men fought from shattered trenches, shell holes, and fortifications half buried by earth. Machine guns fired until barrels overheated. Rifles were used until ammunition ran out. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in places where neither side could withdraw. One German officer later wrote that Verdun felt less like a battlefield and more like a slaughterhouse without walls. Within days, the Germans captured Fort Douaumont, the largest and most important fort in the Verdun system, without a major fight. Its fall sent shockwaves through France. Verdun, it seemed, was already slipping. The French government and military command reacted with alarm. Verdun could not be allowed to fall.
Not politically.
Not psychologically. General Philippe Pétain was placed in command of the defense. His task was not to win a decisive victory.
It was to hold. Pétain understood something critical.
If Verdun became a place where units were destroyed completely, France would collapse. Instead, he instituted a system of constant rotation. Units would be pulled out before breaking and replaced by fresh troops. This decision would save France, and doom hundreds of thousands of men to experience Verdun firsthand. Nearly 3/4 of the French army would eventually pass through the battle.
No one left unchanged.
To keep Verdun supplied, France relied on a single road running from Bar-le-Duc to the front. It became known as the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. Day and night, trucks rolled forward carrying men, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Damaged vehicles were pushed aside immediately. Traffic never stopped. Military police ensured the flow continued regardless of cost. If the road failed, Verdun would fall. French soldiers came to see it as a lifeline, and a conveyor belt into hell. As February turned into March, Verdun settled into its true form. Not a single battle, but a series of overlapping nightmares. Artillery dominated everything. Shellfire never fully ceased. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the smell of explosives. Rain turned the churned earth into a sea of mud that swallowed boots, weapons, and bodies alike. The dead were often left where they fell. There was no time to bury them properly. In some places, the ground was so saturated with remains that soldiers joked grimly that the soil itself was made of flesh.
Shell shock became commonplace. Men shook uncontrollably.
Others went mute. Some stared blankly, unable to move, even under fire. This was the grinder Falkenhayn had envisioned. But something unexpected was happening. France was not breaking. What happened next shocked both sides. Instead of collapsing, French resistance stiffened. Each hill, each ravine, each ruined fort became a point of desperate defense. German advances slowed.
Casualties mounted on both sides.
Verdun was no longer a controlled experiment in attrition. It was becoming a mutual catastrophe, and neither side knew how to stop. It had become clear by March of 1916 that the Battle of Verdun had ceased to be a battle in the accepted meaning of the term. It had moved into a stage that was mechanical, apparently unending, and utterly uninterested in human life. The men were no longer maneuvering for gain. They were being fed into a machine that had a purpose of consuming them. The logic of the Battle of Verdun had ceased to be military. It had moved into the stage of industry. And with that reasoning in place, there was no way out. Weeks passed, and the face of the place that was marked on the map disappeared. Forests, existing for many hundreds of years, were transformed into areas of uprooted trees. Villages disappeared to the point that even the names of the places existed, marked only on the maps and in the directives. Hills were reduced by bombardment.
Ravines were filled.
The earth was churned, a combination of clay, iron, and corpses. Both the French and the German soldiers felt the same thing. The land was alive, and this land hated them. According to historical accounts, artillery fire was so constant that silence itself became terrifying. When the guns stopped, men waited in dread, knowing an infantry assault or gas attack was likely coming next. The earth shook not occasionally, but continuously.
Sleep became impossible.
Even underground shelters offered little protection as shells penetrated deeper with each passing month. One French soldier wrote that Verdun felt like being buried alive while still breathing. Verdun was an artillery battle above all else. Historians estimate that more than 60 million shells were fired over the course of the fighting. This was not precision fire. It was saturation. Entire grid squares were obliterated regardless of what occupied them. Artillery did more than kill. It disoriented, isolated, and broke men psychologically. Trenches collapsed without warning.
Dugouts became tombs.
Men suffocated under tons of earth while comrades above could do nothing but listen. Rescue attempts were often impossible under continued bombardment. Shell shock, initially dismissed as weakness, became impossible to ignore. Soldiers lost control of their limbs. They screamed uncontrollably or fell into catatonic silence. Medical officers struggled to treat injuries that left no visible wounds. The French army would later recognize Verdun as a turning point in understanding psychological trauma. At the time, however, the only solution offered was rotation. Move the broken men out, bring new ones in. The grinder never stopped.
Daily existence at Verdun was a test of endurance beyond imagination.
Men lived surrounded by filth, death, and fear. Rain turned shell holes into cesspools.
Rats grew fat on corpses.
Lice infested uniforms, causing constant itching and infection. Food arrived cold late, or not at all. Water was often contaminated. Medical supplies were scarce. Wounded men sometimes lay for days before evacuation, if evacuation was possible at all. One French infantryman later recalled that the worst moments were not the attacks, but the waiting. Waiting for shells. Waiting for orders.
Waiting to be killed.
German soldiers experienced the same conditions. Verdun did not discriminate. Falkenhayn's strategy depended on one assumption, that Germany could endure losses longer than France. By March, that assumption was proving dangerously flawed. German infantry units advancing through devastated terrain suffered enormous casualties. Artillery that was meant to destroy French resistance also churned the ground so thoroughly that movement became a nightmare. Supply lines struggled.
Communications broke down.
And the French did not collapse. Instead, they adapted. General Philippe Pétain did not attempt dramatic counteroffensives. He focused on something far more important: sustainability. His rotational system ensured that no unit remained at Verdun long enough to be completely destroyed. Soldiers arrived knowing they would leave, if they survived. This knowledge mattered.
It gave men a reason to endure.
Pétain also emphasized artillery coordination, counter-battery fire, and defensive depth. French guns began targeting German artillery positions more effectively, disrupting the enemy's advantage. Verdun became a duel of firepower, not just manpower.
Above all, Pétain understood morale.
His now famous phrase, "Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass," was not empty rhetoric. It became a psychological anchor for France. Verdun was no longer just a military position.
It was the nation itself.
As spring arrived, fighting concentrated around a series of hills and ridges north of Verdun, places that would become synonymous with suffering: Le Mordum, Côte 304, Fleury, and later Fort Vaux. These locations were not valuable for what they contained, but for what they commanded: observation, artillery placement, and psychological dominance. Control shifted repeatedly. Hills were captured, lost, and recaptured within days or even hours. Each change cost hundreds or thousands of lives. At Le Mordum, Dead Man's Hill, artillery fire was so intense that the hill lost nearly its original height. The name ceased to be metaphorical. In June 1916, the battle reached one of its most infamous episodes. Fort Vaux, a concrete fortress southeast of Douaumont, became the scene of a brutal underground siege. German forces surrounded the fort and attempted to take it room by room, tunnel by tunnel. French defenders fought in near darkness. Water ran out. Wounded men lay untreated. Heat, smoke, and lack of oxygen made breathing difficult. According to historical records, Commander Sylvain Raynal refused to surrender until his men were physically incapable of continuing. When Vaux finally fell, the Germans reportedly saluted the defenders for their endurance. Even in hell, there were moments of grim respect. By mid-1916, Verdun had devoured both armies. German losses mounted at rates Falkenhayn had not anticipated. French casualties were catastrophic but sustainable, barely. The grinder was working. Just not in the way Germany had planned. Falkenhayn was eventually replaced. His strategy had failed to deliver decision. Verdun had become a battle without a clear objective, yet neither side could disengage. To abandon Verdun now would be to admit defeat after paying an unimaginable price. So the fighting continued. Verdun had become a war within the larger war. It consumed resources, attention, and manpower that might have been used elsewhere.
It shaped doctrine, morale, and memory.
For soldiers, it became the defining experience of the war. Many who survived later said that everything afterward felt unreal. Verdun had stripped life down to its most basic elements: fear, endurance, and chance. And still, the battle had months left to run. What happened next shocked both sides. Instead of remaining a German offensive, Verdun began to tilt. French forces, reinforced and hardened by months of defense, began preparing to retake what had been lost. The grinder was about to run in reverse. But the cost would be just as high. In the summer of 1916, Verdun had got to a place that no one had intended and from which no one could extricate himself or herself. This had been a German strategy to drain the strength out of France, but this had escalated into a disaster for both sides. The war had ceased to be the concern of strategy alone. This war was the concern of momentum, pride, and the economics of sunk cost. Verdun had now become a test of endurance rather than victory. For Germany, the original intention at Verdun was no longer present. Falkenhayn's policy of guided attrition proved no match for the unguided carnage. The French military showed neither weakness nor crumbling morale. On the contrary, they proved flexible enough to appeal to the unanticipated intentions of the German attackers. The German losses cumulated. The troops, who had been expected to push through a battered French line, found that they were pinned down, struggling for positions that brought them no discernible gain. The artillery superiority continued, although the German margin diminished as the French improved their counter-battery fire. Worse still, Verdun began draining German strength at a time when new threats were emerging elsewhere. In July 1916, the British and French launched the Somme offensive. Though initially disastrous for the Allies, it forced Germany to divert artillery, aircraft, and fresh divisions away from Verdun. The battle that was meant to end the war was now competing with another battle that would also consume hundreds of thousands of lives. Verdun no longer bled France alone. It bled Germany as well. In May 1916, General Philippe Pétain was promoted. He had saved Verdun, but France needed him elsewhere. Command of the Verdun sector passed to General Robert Nivelle.
Nivelle believed in offense.
Unlike Pétain, whose philosophy centered on holding and rotation, Nivelle sought decisive counterattacks. He was confident, energetic, and convinced that aggressive action could break German resistance. According to historical records, Nivelle also believed deeply in artillery coordination. He envisioned short, intense bombardments followed by rapid infantry assaults, not endless weeks of shelling. Verdun was about to change again. The summer months brought no relief. Heat replaced mud, but suffering remained constant. Decomposing bodies emitted a stench that clung to uniforms and skin.
Flies swarmed everywhere.
Water shortages worsened. Disease spread easily among exhausted men living in close quarters. At Fort Sauville, Fleury-de-Vent-Douaumont, and the surrounding ridges, fighting reached a level of intimacy rarely seen on the Western Front. Trenches were often too close for artillery safety. Combat devolved into grenade duels, bayonet charges, and brutal hand-to-hand fighting. Villages like Fleury changed hands more than a dozen times. By the end of the battle, nothing remained. Fleury would later be designated a dead village, never rebuilt, its existence preserved only in memory. Men fought for ground that no longer existed. By mid-1916, Verdun was reshaping how soldiers understood war and themselves. Veterans described a sensation of emotional numbness. Fear did not disappear, it calcified. Men functioned automatically, detached from the reality of what they were doing. Letters home became vague. Soldiers avoided details. Some wrote cheerfully to spare their families. Others stopped writing altogether. One French soldier later recalled that Verdun taught him there was no such thing as courage without terror. Bravery existed only because fear was absolute. German soldiers expressed similar feelings. Diaries speak of a loss of faith, not only in victory, but in meaning itself. Verdun felt endless, purposeless, and consuming. This shared suffering would later shape how both nations remembered the battle. In October 1916, after months of preparation, France launched its major counteroffensive at Verdun. This time, the artillery plan was precise. French guns concentrated fire on specific German positions, supply routes, and batteries. Air superiority, limited but growing, helped direct fire more accurately. Infantry followed closely behind rolling barrages, advancing through terrain that had already been pulverized beyond recognition. The objective was clear: retake Fort Douaumont. Fort Douaumont had fallen early in the battle almost by accident. Its recapture would be symbolic. French troops advanced under heavy fire, moving through smoke and debris. Resistance was fierce, but German defenses were weakened. The fort itself, battered by months of shelling, no longer offered the protection it once had. On October 24, 1916, French forces retook Douaumont. The news electrified France. Verdun, which had come to represent suffering without end, now offered something rare: hope. In early November, Fort Vaux was also recaptured. The same fortress that had become a symbol of heroic resistance earlier in the year now returned to French control. The recapture did not erase the suffering of those who had defended it under siege, but it reframed the narrative of Verdun. What had once seemed like an inevitable descent into destruction now appeared, however briefly, as a story of endurance rewarded. For the soldiers still fighting, the reality remained brutal. Victory did not feel triumphant. It felt exhausting. By December 1916, both sides were spent.
Snow returned.
The front lines stabilized close to where they had been before the battle began, a grim irony not lost on anyone. Verdun officially wound down, not with a treaty or decisive breakthrough, but with exhaustion. The numbers told a horrifying story. According to most historical estimates, approximately 300,000 men were killed at Verdun. More than 700,000 were wounded. Some estimates place total casualties near 1 million, for what amounted to a few kilometers of shattered ground. Verdun did not decide the war, but it defined it. For France, Verdun became a symbol of national survival.
The phrase, ils ne passeront pas, entered the national consciousness.
Verdun proved that France could endure anything, and that endurance itself could be victory. For Germany, Verdun became a warning. It demonstrated the limits of attrition and the danger of battles without clear strategic objectives. For soldiers on both sides, Verdun was something else entirely. It was the place where war stopped being abstract. Nearly every French unit served at Verdun at some point. This meant that the battle's psychological impact spread throughout the entire army. Verdun veterans carried its memory into every later engagement. Some became leaders hardened by experience. Others never fully recovered. German veterans felt the same burden. Verdun became shorthand for the futility and horror of industrial warfare. Long after the guns fell silent, Verdun continued to shape minds. Verdun left behind more than graves and memorials. It left behind lessons, many of which were ignored. It showed that modern war could consume nations without delivering clarity or resolution. It demonstrated that symbolic objectives could become traps. It revealed how quickly human life could be reduced to numbers on a staff map. And yet, despite everything, Verdun did not end the war. The conflict still had 2 years to run. And even worse battles awaited. What happened next would ripple far beyond Verdun. The lessons learned there would influence tactics, leadership, and memory. They would also shape the myths, resentments, and political movements that emerged after the war. Verdun was not just a battle. It was a warning, one that the world would fail to heed. So when the guns ceased firing around the edge of Verdun at the end of 1916, the battlefield did not become peaceful once more. It could never become peaceful again. The earth has been changed and the men who fought upon it. For those who fought there, Verdun did not end in December. The battle stayed with those who fought there after the war ended. The ground surrounding Verdun was unlike any other part of the Western Front. Even years after the war, the ground remained a hazardous area. Anti-personnel shells were buried beneath the ravaged earth. Poison gas still lingered within the ground. The rain would turn up skeletal remains, helmets, rifle parts, and other debris that had been interred beneath the earth for so. Agriculturalists had little chance of recolonizing much of this area. Whole regions had been declared non-habitable, the Rouges zones. The forests, when they grew back, were deformed, with soil inundated with metal and corpse matter. Verdun became a permanent wound on the French landscape. Visitors who arrived after the war were often shocked. They expected a battlefield. What they found was something closer to a grave without boundaries. For the men who survived Verdun, returning to civilian life was not a return at all. According to veterans' accounts, many struggled to sleep without the sound of artillery. Silence felt threatening.
Sudden noises triggered panic.
Crowds caused anxiety. Some men found themselves unable to explain what they had seen, even to those who loved them.
France had won Verdun,
but it had paid for that victory with its nervous system. German veterans carried similar scars. Verdun was remembered not as a noble effort, but as a senseless abyss. Diaries and memoirs written after the war often describe a loss of faith, in leadership, in purpose, in the idea that war could ever be rational. Both sides emerged changed. Nations do not remember wars exactly as they happened. They remember them as they need to. In France, Verdun was transformed into a symbol of unity and endurance.
The phrase « Ils ne passeront pas » became a national creed.
Verdun was framed as the moment France stood unbroken against annihilation.
Monuments rose.
Cemeteries expanded. The ossuary at Douaumont was constructed to hold the remains of unidentified soldiers, French and German alike. Their bones were placed together, indistinguishable in death. Verdun became sacred ground. In Germany, the memory took a different shape. Verdun became evidence of betrayal by leadership, proof that soldiers had been sacrificed for strategies that never made sense. This perception would later feed resentment and radical political narratives. The same battle produced two very different memories. Militarily, Verdun forced armies to confront the realities of industrial warfare. Artillery coordination, logistics, rotation systems, and combined arms tactics evolved directly from the experience. But strategically, the deeper lesson was harder to accept. Verdun demonstrated that wars of attrition favored nations with greater resources, not greater bravery. It showed that symbolic objectives could become traps. It revealed that endurance alone could replace victory as a political goal. Yet these lessons were only partially absorbed. When the war ended in 1918, the world rushed to impose peace without fully understanding what Verdun and battles like it had revealed about modern conflict. The Treaty of Versailles ended the war on paper, but it did not resolve the forces Verdun had exposed. Germany emerged defeated and humiliated. Its veterans returned to a society racked by inflation, political violence, and anger. Many believed their sacrifices had been meaningless. Others believed they had been betrayed. France, though victorious, was exhausted. Entire regions were devastated. A generation of young men was gone. Fear of another Verdun shaped every political decision. French strategy in the interwar years was defensive. The Maginot Line, a massive system of fortifications, was built to prevent another slaughter like Verdun. It was a monument to memory
and to fear.
When Europe drifted toward war again in the 1930s, Verdun hovered in the background of every decision. French leaders were determined never to repeat the experience. German leaders remembered Verdun as proof that attrition must be avoided at all costs. These memories shaped doctrine. Germany emphasized speed, maneuver, and decisive blows. France emphasized defense, fortification, and delay. Both sides believed they had learned the right lessons.
Both were wrong.
When the Second World War erupted, Verdun was invoked constantly by politicians, generals, and propagandists. It became a reference point for courage, suffering, and sacrifice. But the war that followed would dwarf it. Verdun's true legacy is not found in maps or casualty figures. It lies in what the battle revealed about modern humanity. It showed how industrial systems could transform killing into routine, how leadership could justify unimaginable loss in the name of endurance, how symbolism could outweigh strategy, how men could survive conditions that should have destroyed them, and carry those scars for life. Verdun exposed the gap between political decisions and human consequences. It proved that once war becomes a process rather than an event, it no longer needs victory to continue. When soldiers described Verdun as living hell, they were not using metaphor. Hell, in religious imagination, is eternal suffering without meaning or escape. Verdun felt exactly like that. Men entered knowing they might never leave. They fought not for progress, but to avoid collapse. They endured not because they believed in victory, but because the alternative was worse. That is what made Verdun different. It was not about conquest. It was about survival under impossible conditions. Verdun matters because it forces uncomfortable questions. How much suffering is acceptable in defense of national pride? At what point does endurance become cruelty? Can a war be won if it destroys the people who fight it? These questions did not end in 1916. They echo through every modern conflict. Verdun did not end the First World War, but it stripped away every illusion that had sustained it. After Verdun, no one could honestly claim that war was glorious. No one could pretend that courage alone determined outcomes. No one could deny that modern conflict was capable of consuming entire societies. Verdun showed the future. And the future was brutal. 2 years after Verdun ended, the war itself would finally conclude. But the world that emerged was unstable, resentful, and armed with unfinished lessons.
Another war was coming.
And when it did, the grinder would return. Larger, faster, and even more destructive. Verdun had been a warning. The world had listened. But it had not understood. When historians refer to the end of Verdun as being in December of 1916, what they are referring to is the official close.
Orders were changed, maps were revised, troops rotated off.
However, when it comes to the true ways that the end of Verdun is significant, the fact is that Verdun itself did not end. Verdun placed itself firmly inside the 20th century and wouldn't leave. Verdun existed as a memory, an ideology, an apprehension. And as a warning the world ignored. For the men who lived through the Verdun slaughter, time became fractured. Many veterans spoke of their lives as consisting of 2 eras, before Verdun and after Verdun. The time before seemed almost unreal, while the time after consisted of the aftermath of what they experienced at Verdun. French veterans spoke of the inability to explain Verdun to anyone who had not been there. Words failed.
Photographs lied.
Official histories felt sanitized. Even fellow soldiers who had fought elsewhere struggled to grasp what Verdun had been. Some men became withdrawn, incapable of reconnecting with civilian life. Others became fiercely patriotic, clinging to the belief that suffering must have meant something. A smaller number turned bitter, convinced that they had been sacrificed by leaders who never understood the battlefield. German veterans expressed similar disillusionment. Verdun reinforced the sense that the war had not been lost purely on the battlefield, but squandered by strategy that valued abstraction over human reality. This belief would later be exploited by extremist movements seeking to weaponize resentment. Verdun did not just wound bodies.
It rewired minds.
Armies, like nations, remember selectively. French military doctrine after the war was shaped deeply by Verdun. The emphasis was on defense, fortification, and minimizing casualties. The Maginot Line was not merely concrete and steel. It was Verdun turned into architecture, an attempt to make endurance automatic, to prevent another human grinder from forming. Germany drew the opposite lesson. Verdun convinced German planners that attritional warfare was suicidal. Speed, shock, and decisive maneuver would be the answer next time. Blitzkrieg was not born solely from innovation.
It was born from trauma.
Both interpretations were incomplete. Verdun had shown what happened when war became industrialized and prolonged, but it had not revealed how to prevent that outcome. It only showed how desperately nations would try. In France, Verdun became sacred. Annual ceremonies, preserved battlefields, and the Douaumont ossuary transformed the site into a national shrine. Schoolchildren learned its name early. Politicians invoked it often. Verdun became proof that France could endure anything. In Germany, Verdun became something darker. It symbolized futility and betrayal. While official commemorations were more subdued, the memory lingered in veterans' organizations, memoirs, and political rhetoric. The same battlefield generated opposite emotional truths, and neither was neutral. Memory does not merely preserve history.
It shapes the future.
The interwar period was haunted by Verdun even when it was not named. European leaders spoke endlessly of peace, yet prepared relentlessly for war.
Arms limitations coexisted with rearmament. Diplomatic assurances coexisted with fear.
The language of never again coexisted with the mechanics of next time. Verdun taught leaders that total war required total preparation. It did not teach them how to avoid total war. The silence between 1918 and 1939 was not calm.
It was compressed.
When the Second World War began, it did not resemble Verdun at first.
It moved faster. It looked decisive. It appeared modern. But as the conflict deepened, the grinder returned. Stalingrad, Leningrad, Monte Cassino, Kursk, Iwo Jima. Different places, different flags.
Same logic. Verdun had not been an anomaly.
It had been a prototype. Industrial.
Verdun stripped war of its illusions. It showed that courage could not overcome machine guns, that sacrifice could be infinite without being meaningful, that strategy divorced from human cost becomes cruelty by default. Most importantly, Verdun revealed how modern systems amplify decisions beyond control. Once mobilization begins, once production accelerates, once morale becomes a resource to be managed, stopping becomes harder than continuing. That truth extends far beyond Verdun. It applies to every modern conflict shaped by bureaucracy, technology, and ideology. Verdun was chosen because it mattered too much to abandon. By the end, it mattered too much to justify.
France held Verdun.
Germany failed to break France, and both paid a price that neither could ever fully recover from. Verdun did not produce victory. It produced survival. And survival in that context was considered success.
Today, Verdun is quiet. Grass grows where men once drowned in mud.
Trees stand where artillery erased forests. Tourists walk paths that were once killing grounds. But the silence is deceptive. Verdun still speaks, to anyone willing to listen. It speaks of the limits of endurance, of the danger of symbolism elevated above humanity, of leaders who believe suffering can be managed like supply. It speaks of what happens when war stops being a decision and becomes a process. Verdun was not the bloodiest battle of the First World War, but it was the most honest. It did not promise glory. It did not reward ambition. It did not offer clarity. It revealed only this: that modern war, once unleashed, does not need victory to justify itself. It needs only continuation. The soldiers who called Verdun living hell were not exaggerating. They were naming something new in human history. A place where suffering became routine.
Where death lost meaning through repetition.
Where survival itself felt like a burden. Verdun was not just a battle. It was the moment the modern world saw what it was capable of doing to itself. And once seen, it could never be unseen.